Hey, welcome back to my channel. I make weekly art tutorials, paint-alongs and vlogs. And last week I asked my MVPs for video suggestions and ideas as to what to post or what people would like to see. And there was very much a Christmas theme. So in this video, I'm going to be taking you along with me as I make watercolor Christmas cards. Hope you enjoy and let's get into it. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on and experimenting with Christmas baubles. If you've caught my past videos, then you've seen my kind of botanical Christmas themed cards already, and this is just one of the tutorials that I did in the past. And I'll leave a link if you want to catch this one. But for now, let's get into what you'll need. Use basic watercolor supplies, so watercolor paper, watercolor paints, a paintbrush, a pen, a pencil, and if you want to add an extra element, then you can also use a gold pen. I used A5 pieces of watercolor paper that I'll later stick onto A4 pieces of folded card, just so that I can make the most of the watercolor paper. Essentially, the reason that I had so much fun with this is because of, I think, the background for the most part, because I could really just experiment. So I used the wet on wet technique, which basically means that I wet the paper and then add wet paint onto it so that the colors can blend into each other and merge nicely. And as long as they dry at the same time, there are no blooms, and it can kind of give you a nice effect. One of the drawbacks of watercolor, or not necessarily drawbacks, but one of the things with watercolor though is that once it dries, it does kind of all fade. So sometimes you have to do this quite a few times. But I was happy with the effect that I had. I used the heat gun purely because I was impatient, not because it's necessary. So once the background was completely dry, I then started off by doing the baubles. And the main thing was just mapping out where I wanted them to be and then trying to remember where the shadow would be on a sphere, which essentially would be at the bottom, and where the light spot would be. And then the next challenge was just blending so that the edges weren't so harsh because they wouldn't necessarily be on a sphere. And also adding layers because, as you can see, as the watercolor dries, it kind of fades a bit. So this is just a nice and simple template that you can use to make your own cards. You can do different colors, different backgrounds, lots of different colors in the background, and really just make it your own. At this point, I kind of felt that it looked a little bit plain and I wanted to add a few more elements. So this is where I brought in my gold pen. If you yourself don't have a gold pen, but you have white gel pen or black gel pen, then this can be the opportunity that you can use to just add little embellishments to make it a little bit more festive. The alternative is, if you pre-plan ahead what pattern you want on the baubles, then you can either use masking fluid or just avoiding those areas in order to have those designs. And then you add a Merry Christmas, and hey ho, there is your first design. So for the second design, similar, I had lots of fun with the background, and each time it dried, I wanted to add more depth and more layers and more colors. And once I was satisfied, I started with the baubles again. So main thing was remembering where is going to be the brightest bit and where is going to be the darkest bit. So with this kind of shaped bauble, the bit that kind of protrudes, so the middle bit is going to have an area of light, as well as in my head, the light would be coming from the right, so that area would have light. And the bottom bit of the bauble and the left hand side would be the darkest bit. So those are the bits that I would have to just add a bit more color. One of the nice things about watercolor is that if you do end up painting over all of it, like I did here for example, and the paint is still wet, and you, depending on what paint you're using, so this is the Cotman set, you can just lift the paint by using a wet paintbrush that has no paint on it, and that just helps you create highlights where need be. So for this one, this bauble, I wanted to do something slightly different by having it kind of ribbed, and the way that I did that was I made the top and the bottom darkest still, the left hand side still dark, and then I just used a darker bit of paint in the second layer to just do lines going down. There isn't an exact science to it. I just made sure that each layer that I was going on top of, I was making the watercolor darker, which is the general principle anyway, and that I was going thinner as well so that you could see the different shades of red underneath. And then I used a Posca pen to add a few more highlights and got onto the next design. So again, I use a pencil to just get my rough composition down and figure out where exactly I want the baubles and what shapes I want, how many I want. I then tape off the sides, which is completely extra and you don't have to do. I just wanted to have like a nice clean border, and also if you're going to stick it onto a piece of card, you know where that's going to be. And then I do the wet on wet technique to get the background. So again, as you can see, I'm putting wet paint onto a wet piece of paper, and that's why the paint is just spreading like that. And I think there are different things that you could do. So I think because it's blue, it's giving me like sky vibes. So one of the things that I could have done, or that perhaps you may also want to do, is if you have a white gel pen, just draw on, or if you have white gouache, just draw or paint on some snowflakes on there to just really give it a Christmassy vibe. But I did the same thing that I did earlier. So I started off with the base color, which I did using the wet on wet technique, and then I figure out where my shadows are going to be, where my lightest area is going to be, and I try to leave it clear. But if I accidentally go over it, then I use a wet brush to get off as much of the paint as I can, and I just keep doing it wet on wet so that there's nice transitions rather than harsh lines. And then I go over with darker colors and make the baubles ribbed. And then I do the gold bit at the top, leaving a white spot to the right because that's where my light is coming from, and then making it slightly darker on the left to represent a shadow. And then I use my fine liner to go all the way around it and draw a straight line at the top to represent them hanging. Now for this one, I wanted to do something slightly different, and that was to experiment with simple snowscapes. So the way that I did it was, I knew that I was going to do a bauble, so again I did the circle. I started off by doing wet on wet technique to do the rough shape of trees, and these are trees that are going to be in the distance, so it's fine that they kind of fade, and it's fine that they're not in any detail. And then the next layer I did it a bit darker and a bit darker until I came to the tree that's going to be at the forefront. So when you want something to be sharp and in focus, you want it to be wet on dry technique. And to create the trees, which I think are called like pine cone trees, I basically just did individual strokes going down in the direction that I would think the bristles would go once the paper was dry. And if I'd waited even longer, then I would have been able to get even more detail at the end. For the next bauble, I wanted a close-up of a Christmas tree, and the thing with painting snow on a tree or snow in general is that you're painting the shadows as opposed to the snow itself. And I think initially I was trying to represent that using like Payne's grey and a really dark colour, but then I just found that it was bringing down the mood a bit too much, and yeah, I didn't quite like it. So instead I started using like this nice shade of blue, which you're seeing here. So for this tree I basically did the same thing as I was doing below. So a rough triangle, do each individual bristle going down in the direction that I think it would normally be going, having first started off by doing it wet on wet technique and then wet on dry technique when I want to add the extra details. And then I added a few baubles for fun, because why not make it even more Christmassy? And last but not least, I did a bauble with a snowman. So again, starting off, you're getting the drill with wet on wet technique. So letting the paint kind of seep in and blend nicely. And then I did the horizon line where I thought the snowman would go. And as I mentioned earlier, with snow, you paint the shadows, not the actual snow itself. In the light coming in from the right, I just painted a semicircle for the bottom half of the snowman, another semicircle for the body, and a semicircle for the head. Then I added on a hat, and then I thought it would looking a little bit plain, so I did another tree on the side. So again, it's kind of wet on wet, so it was blending into the background, so the focus remains on the snowman. And then I just kept going back and adding more and more layers, but keeping it blue and Christmassy and kind of giving it a cold kind of feel. And to tie it all together, I added a fence at the back. So these are our three separate baubles, and I went back to add extra details and then started tying it all in to actually make them look like baubles. So again, adding the gold kind of bits at the top, making sure that I leave a white spot towards the right where the light comes in, and then making the left hand side a bit darker. I added some more highlights and more snow with my Posca pen, and you could use gouache to do that as well, or acrylic paint to do that. And then I used my fine liner to just go over it and tie everything together and add the piece of string, and that completes the final painting. So here's a quick flip through of the designs that we've created, as well as some of the practice that I did beforehand when I was trying to get a bit more comfortable with painting snow. And I actually saw a good YouTube video, which I'll link down below, that was quite helpful. And you can also see my new sketchbook, which I'm absolutely loving. I created it myself. I'm still working out the kinks, which is why I haven't created a video on it or anything like that. But I can create a video all about it later on if that's something that you're interested in. Thank you so much for making it this far into my video. You're the real MVP. Let me know if you made it this far by telling me which of the Bauble designs is your favorite. Is it the green, the yellow, the blue, or the snow? So that's green, yellow, blue, or snow. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Bye.